Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about abuse in the media. With me today, I have Taryn Kutujian. Taryn uses she, her pronouns and is the Community Education Manager at Vibes Family Violence and Rape Crisis Center in Suffolk County in Long Island. Taryn is a licensed social worker and specializes in program development, virtual learning, and volunteer coordination. So Taryn, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be with you.
I'm really excited as well. And I also have joining us Megan Asmussen. Megan uses she, her pronouns and is one of our social justice pre-practicum interns at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. Megan is working on her master's in mental health counseling and the college and university counseling certificate from Rollins College. So Megan, thank you as well for being here today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
I'm super excited to have this conversation with you both. Just as a really brief introduction, on this podcast, we talk a lot about rape culture, which refers to the culture in which props up and perpetuates rape and sexual violence. Some examples of rape culture can include victim blaming, not holding abusers accountable, the glamorization of sexual violence, and just many more. But today we're going to really address the issue of using rape and sexual violence as a character development trope. That a character, particularly female characters, must endure abuse and sexual violence in order to become empowered, and how this can contribute to rape culture. We're also going to just really be talking about different things in the media and how they depict sexual violence in a positive or a negative way. So in this podcast, we're going to be talking about things like Game of Thrones, Precious, Perks of Being a Wallflower, Sweeney Todd, Shameless, 50 Shades of Grey, those kinds of things. So just forewarning, this will have a lot of spoilers. So keep that in mind as we move forward. But with that, I wanted to first start off with you, Taryn. If you could just talk a little bit about Vibes and what you do there, and a little bit about the training that kind of brought to life this particular podcast.
Sure, absolutely. So Vibes, as you mentioned, is located in Suffolk County, Long Island. We're located in New York. So through the beauty of technology, it's amazing that we get to connect with individuals like yourself who are doing amazing work, all over the world and all over the country. So Vibes provides free services and confidential services to residents and their families of Suffolk County. We include free advocacy, legal assistance, public assistance, trauma-informed counseling on a short and long-term basis, as well as sexual assault nurse examinations in the event someone identifies as being raped or assaulted and arrives at our partner hospitals. They can receive an evidence collection kit that they can utilize for up to 20 years in the event that they would like to take that information forward with convictions or with an investigation. We also have an amazing team of professionals who are so dedicated and so passionate, people who are attorneys, people who are advocates, who go to court accompaniment and join people and navigate them through order orders of protection or custody proceedings or divorce proceedings or things of that nature. And all of the services that we provide are all free, they're all confidential, and they're all specifically for people who have experienced any form of violence in the form of abuse, whether it's elder abuse, child abuse, human trafficking, rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, all of these types of things. We see individuals as young as 3 years old, all the way up until wherever you are. We also have a 24-hour hotline that is available at any time. So if Vibes can't assist you, we can connect you with another agency that can assist you. And we do work many times with out-of-state referrals. So it's even more important for us to have these great partnerships with you so that, we can continue to keep each other informed and spread the word. So thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for everything that you all do at Vibes. It sounds very similar to what we do at the Victim Service Center. So I'm really happy to always, connect with other rape crisis centers such as yourselves. Absolutely. It's amazing that we can connect during this time. I think normally we wouldn't be able to, but I'm really glad that we can. If you could talk a little bit about like what you do at Vibes as well as that training, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. So I'm the community education manager at Vibes. And basically what I do is I coordinate with groups in the community. Now it's strictly virtual, but we do all types of trainings for professionals, for community groups, for individual groups, let's say student groups, student leaders, campus coordination. I also will manage all of the internal trainings here for our staff. So their core competency trainings and managing professional trainings for different agencies all over the island, such as Suffolk County DSS, Office of the Aging, Child Protective Services, things of that nature. And the webinar that as part of our virtual experiences, the webinar that we created was similar to what Emilie was talking about. We really started to think about, how sexual violence is represented in the media. So the webinar I put together is the complexity of power and abuse. And really it looked at through the lens of media and through the lens of popular culture, looking at Game of Thrones and The Handmaid's Tale and kind of dissecting different characters and looking at the conclusions and the assumptions that the shows make based on how the characters are, grow through the series.
Awesome. I love everything that you're doing and really, really important topics that you bring up. So I guess from there, I think we should start to delve into the topic here, which I have my first question, which is really, how does the message of rape and sexual violence as character development influence the real world and rape culture?
So, I think for me, when I was thinking about this question for the webinar that I did, you start to see very clearly, the pathways that are laid out. And although the intention is not to approach it with a gender lens, at least in my initial assumptions, that's eventually what happened. There is so much of a clear cut pathway, for lack of a better way to say it, for sexual violence, specifically as it affects women. And it's at least in my experience from the things I've seen and the things I've witnessed, it's so much of the sexual violence as a vehicle for empowerment, as a vehicle for self-identity, for expression, something that is sort of a reckoning, a moment of awakening for this person, although it's wrapped up in a violence and a sort of, lack of control and lack of consent. So for me, when I was looking at this, it was very much in line with, certain shows like Game of Thrones, one of the ones I addressed on the webinar. It was very much a primary vehicle specifically for women, for character development. There were many, many other characters in Game of Thrones, I'm sure we'll get to and we'll discuss, that whose development and whose trajectory through the series was very different. Some may argue equally violent, but not involving rape.
Absolutely. And I think that you're absolutely right. And I appreciate that you came at it with like an open mind of like, obviously in the real world, sexual violence affects everyone, regardless of gender, regardless of age, that kind of thing. And it seems though that in media, it seems to be, as you mentioned, typically a female victim that is depicted in the media. That being said, where you were talking a lot about, you brought up Game of Thrones and like other fantasy. And of course, these things aren't real, right? But I kind of want to explore, how does this maybe contribute to rape culture? How does it have like real effects, do you think, on society and kind of at large? How does this kind of do a detriment for survivors and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I that's an excellent question, and I think, you know, even as we're talking about this now, and just thinking about, you know, what you just said about the female character is typically, you know, the one exposed, and when we think about, you know, preconceptions or assumptions that people have about who the victim of violence is, you know, typically many people don't factor in children, don't factor in men, don't factor veterans in, undocumented individuals, people with disabilities. While it's absolutely true that women are victims of violence and survivors of sexual violence, it also perpetuates, like you're saying, to rape culture, that there is one type and that the victim maybe looks a certain way or has a certain type of path, or that rape is always a trajectory to healing and empowerment. And for some people, they do find themselves healed and they are, you know, empowered through different ways through the course of therapy and treatment, but it's by no means a mechanism for, you know, a transformation for someone to take place. And I feel like that's how it's perpetuated in our media.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't know if Megan, you have any thoughts on that you want to kind of chime in on?
Yeah, I think the one population I would add to that too is those who do sex work and choose to, you know, whether it's through prostitution, stripping, what have you. Like, you know, we see the CSI did, where definitely more positive messages now, like, oh, you just because you dress a certain way doesn't mean you deserve it. But these characters are still having these occupations and being represented in this way more than others. And I think too, like, that speaks to the overall outside of the media and, for lack of a better word, real life, where, you know, there is still the stigma around sex work, even though it is just as much a job as any others.
I think you bring up such a really important point, which is, you know, perpetuating these stigmas and these myths surrounding sexual violence. For example, you know, only promiscuous women are the ones that get raped, or kind of that victim blaming mentality of that as well. And of course, just having a lack of representation of survivors in general. It's a really important, I think, that we break down those myths so that we can fully understand sexual violence, so that we can help prevent it. And if we have these ideas of like, it only happens to women and it only happens to promiscuous women and only happens if you wear this certain outfit, you know, obviously that's just misinformation. And breaking down victim blaming and stuff like that is so important. So yeah, I completely agree. With that, I was hoping that we could delve a little more into those examples that you were mentioning. So what are some examples in the media having these narratives? And are there any common themes among these narratives that you wanted to highlight?
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, in addition to sort of, you know, Game of Thrones, what we're talking about already, some interesting examples came to mind for me, you know, as I was thinking about this topic. One is American History X. So it's a little bit of an older movie at this point. It stars Edward Norton. It's by far, you know, critics will say it's one of the best movies, the best pieces of work he's ever done. So I encourage all of you, if you're interested in seeing it, to please do so. But basically, the long and short of it is that he starts out as a white supremacist, and not only just a white supremacist, he's the white supremacist. He's the leader of the group. He's the total alpha male in every way, physically dominating, physically intimidating, you know, basically has to snap his fingers and people will do whatever he wants. And, you know, through the course of one of the hate crimes that he committed, he killed several people and he's put in jail. And the rest of the story talks about his experience in jail, but it also frames his experience from when he's telling his younger brother about his experience being raped in jail. Now, this is really interesting. This is an interesting example for a couple of reasons. So the main character, the hero, the protagonist of this story is the anti-hero. So he's somebody who's inherently evil, is introduced to you as evil, as, you know, somebody who shouldn't be saved, so to speak. You know, then he goes through this, his quote unquote reckoning. He goes through this a brutal rape in jail, where his power and control is completely obliterated. He's wiped off the map. He is literally a shell of who he is. And he's explaining to his younger brother how much he's reckoned with and how much he's learned and how much he's experienced, and he's trying to basically save his younger brother from going down the same path, because while he's in jail, his younger brother is being groomed to basically take the role of the brother who is now in jail. So interesting for that reason, because what we're talking about, we were just talking about female character development and how rape and sexual assault is used to empower those characters. And this is really one of the only examples I can think of in recent, modern media, where there's actually a male protagonist or the anti-hero who experiences that rape and sexual assault, who internalizes it in the same way that we as a culture encourage people, to pull up your bootstraps and keep on going. So he sort of utilizes it in the story as a mechanism for his transformation, which is an argument that some people can make and some people can talk about. But again, it's framing it from one singular point of view.
That's such a great example, Taryn. It brings up a lot of different things. And I think that, there's this issue of course, like being defined by what happened to you, which we always want to like kind of break that down a little bit. It's not what's wrong with me, it's what happened to me, right? And it's part of the healing journey. Of course, it depends on the survivor, of course, on how they identify, but heal and those kinds of things. I think it could be quite problematic if that is used as character development, if that makes sense, in a non-responsible way.
Absolutely. I think it also speaks to, some of the sayings in our culture and our society that people, you don't know what it's like to go through something. Well, what does that mean? And what is that definition of going through something? All of us are going through things at every moment of our lives, but what defines, somebody being worthy or just, or let's say, in this example, this was used as a tool for his redemption, as really being fully broken down to be built up again. And, in that way, it implies that something as severe and as brutal as rape was the only thing that could have, been that catalyst for him, which, like you're saying, Emilie, sends a problematic message, because it's basically, one of the things that it's implying is that, we have to get to the worst possible point that we're at to actually change and grow. And that doesn't have to happen. We don't have to experience, a brutal, traumatic event to become a better person.
Absolutely. Megan, I wanted to see if you had any examples that you kind of wanted to delve into as it relates to the topic.
Yeah, I first wanted to add to, this message of, when the worst of the worst happens to you, you in a way become the person you were supposed to be. This completely takes away the character of the abuser. And this in a way has them off the hook. They're not talked about. We don't see the repercussions. Therefore, that what they did is not a big deal and nothing will happen if you do this too, type of situation. But I know one of the big examples I thought of was Lucy Barker's character in Sweeney Todd, and how, for those of you who don't know, she was the wife of Benjamin Barker at the time, who would become Sweeney Todd. And while Benjamin Barker was arrested, Lucy was actually raped by Judge Turpin, who, it's been a while since I've seen the movie, so I'm not sure what kind of background dynamic there was with that situation. But nonetheless, there was still sexual assault involved. And, we see early on when we have the background of their marriage and when there are the flashbacks that Sweeney Todd has, she's beautiful, smiling, kind of living her life to the best. It's very much like the typical woman where the flashbacks are to her looks, and she kind of has this, she's shining, her skin is rosy, different things like that. But then after she stands up against the judge and backs her husband, and then the assault happens, she turns into this like beggar woman almost, where she survives an attempt of poisoning, also known as suicide. And, she kind of turns into this role of insanity, and how, she becomes her mental illnesses, and, her character completely changes all because of this assault, which, you know, I feel like this is kind of the flip side of what we're talking about too, where, you know, this is kind of the message of, oh, if you experience this, you can't come back from it. You become your assault now, and you become the mental health illnesses or physical illnesses that are a result of the assault, which is far from the truth. You, no matter what your diagnoses are, if you have them, or whatever kind of mental health symptoms you have, you are not your symptoms. And, you know, but the media representing it in this way kind of tells you opposite. And I feel like that really feeds to not only rape culture, but also mental health stigma as well.
That is such a good point, Megan. And I want to also I'm starting to remember that story too. And a lot of times it is they're kind of critiquing like society within Sweeney Todd. And I think that we can take that as an example of, yeah, you know, she really just had the support that she needed. I'm sure that it might have turned out a little differently. You know, if there were like people like Vibes, people like the VSC there for her, then, you know, maybe getting through her healing journey would be better. And of course, keeping that stigma too, of mental health in general. That's a tough one too, and very detrimental.
One thing I've noticed, you know, as you bring up society, is that there's this overarching theme, especially in American culture, of, you know, if there's some sort of sexual act, especially if it's from a woman, like this isn't okay. And having the media give out examples of it as well kind of reinforces that message, which therefore affects real life examples too.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I love, Megan, what you said about the abuser being, you know, almost absolved, almost not even involved. And it's interesting, you know, to speak to Emilie's question about rape culture and what social norms exist in our culture to perpetuate these ideas. And I think that's why so many of us watch movies or watch shows or read books or listen to music, and we hear it or see it from a totally different perspective. But then when we have these lenses on, you know, that lens of really looking at it through the sexual violence lens and seeing all of these things, it's so ingrained in us as a social norm that we actually have to work at picking it apart to see it for what it really is. It's almost like, you know, the puzzle is all put together and you have to take the pieces apart one by one to actually see it, you know. So that's really, really interesting that you brought that up. And I think it speaks to, you know, that overall theme in our society of look at the victim, you know, what's going on with the victim, and well, why was he or she there, what were they wearing, what were they doing, and very little, if any, attention is paid to the abuser. And if it is, it's typically to protect the abuser, and obviously not in all cases, but it's an excellent point that you bring up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for like bringing that and highlighting and uplifting that, Taryn. That's absolutely true. And I think that that's, you know, part of rape culture when I do my trainings. Of course, we have so many examples of it, so I can't go over all examples of rape culture, but one of them is not holding abusers accountable. And I think that these kinds of stories, if they're done in a certain way, in a non you know, responsible way, can definitely perpetuate rape culture for sure. Were there any other examples that y'all wanted to kind of delve into and talk more about?
Yeah, I feel like a big one that I actually just thought of, and it's very impactful because it's a childhood movie. When we think of the movie Hercules, you know, it's mostly his story talking about, okay, he's going through the epitome of hero's journey. One of the first ones we see in Hercules is based off of the Iliad and Odyssey, and how he's the epitome of hero's journey. When we go through it in high school, like that's the example we usually have. But we don't tend to look at the character of Meg and how, when she's introduced, she's fighting off a predator. And her whole story is about how she is, in a way, a victim of Hades, trying to prevent from going to hell because of something a man did to her. Like from what I understand, she made this promise to Hades that as long as this man loves her forever and stays with her forever, then she won't go to hell. And there's probably some backstory that's not part of it for the sake of being a Disney movie. But basically, she's trying to fight off Hades. We see her fighting off the centaur, and then throughout she's like, that's basically her whole character, and Hercules is the one who comes in and saves the day for her. And like it's like she became the damsel in distress because of her experience with men, either at the beginning of the movie or as like the storyline prior.
Megan, I think that's really interesting that you brought that up. And as you're talking about it, it's making me think of, like every Shakespeare play I've ever read. And, one of the biggest themes in Shakespeare and in Renaissance literature was the woman's power was a direct result of what man she was attached to and who her family was and who she was connected to. And it had absolutely nothing to do with what was in her brain, what was coming out of her, nothing. Like it was just about who she attached to. And you just reminded me of that's such a strong theme throughout culture. And even like, let's say, bring it back to Game of Thrones, Daenerys's first really moment was being given to Khal Drogo. She had no say, she had no ownership. This was a transaction, it was a business deal. So there's so much that's gone back literally hundreds of years in our culture where we're conditioned to sort of normalize and accept and want somebody as a woman to belong, to attach to you, to be with you in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think we can probably delve even deeper into Game of Thrones if you'd like to, Taryn, and how they use kind of abuse in and how that could kind of maybe perpetuate some rape culture in that sense. If you want to, if you'd like to delve deeper into kind of what you go through in your training, feel free to do so.
Sure, absolutely. So I know we've mentioned Reek. We've mentioned Theon Greyjoy to Reek, and that's really, one of the largest. I think there are a few characters in Game of Thrones that are standout, for many reasons. But Theon Greyjoy's transformation from Theon to Reek is really one of probably the most accurate ways that an abuser can manipulate and use all those tools in the power and control wheel, understanding what he was vulnerable to. He was a womanizer, Theon Greyjoy. So what his penis is cut off at one point to fully demasculate him. And that's when he's given his new name. And at that point, he basically decides to give up mentally, spiritually, where he becomes this character. He becomes the embodiment of all of the nasty and brutal and violence and disgust that people feel and express. And so he becomes that physical embodiment of that. He's never raped. That's not to say that he doesn't have a brutal assault. He's, brutally demeaned and attacked. He absolutely is. But it's interesting, given the amount of rape that is rampant in Game of Thrones and how much sex is used as a weapon and as a tool in Game of Thrones, is very interesting that only went so far with Theon Greyjoy. It was only gone so far, and he was demasculated in a very different way than, a woman might have been, in terms of losing all that power and control.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to bring up, especially within the world of Game of Thrones. And again, I want to invite to everyone who's like listening, as we critique these things and look at them, we don't have to assign an entire viewpoint of like a holistic, like, okay, all of Game of Thrones is terrible. That's not what we're saying. We're just kind of like looking at piecing it apart, just like you were saying, Taryn, of like taking out the puzzle pieces and being like, oh, how should I process this? How do I feel about this? And we're just kind of inviting everyone to look at things from a sexual violence educator kind of perspective. So with that, I don't know if you wanted to, you talked a little bit about, Reek and Theon's journey, which of course is an excellent example of how they used abuse to basically become his story, right? Because it even changed his name. It changed his entire identity, which is, a critique of, well, not a critique, but an example of, as you mentioned, abuse and abusers and the manipulation tactics and stuff like that. But I wanted to invite, if you wanted to talk a little bit about more of the women in Game of Thrones, kind of their stories as well.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And I think Theon and really all of the other characters, Daenerys, Sansa, that find themselves in a position where they're brutalized at some point in the show, they're all speaking to the vulnerability, the aspects of vulnerability that we all know, that may make somebody more likely to become a victim of abuse or to be targeted for abuse. Things like having no family. All Jon Snow, Daenerys, Theon, they were all orphans. They were all either given away, their parents were either killed, or they didn't know who they were and they were alone in this world. So all three of them are really trying to find their way. You have someone like Cersei, on the other hand, who really utilized sex as a tool and as a strategy, and who still, in moments of trying to control and regulate her behavior, sex was used against her the way she typically would use it against other people. So there's a lot more duality with Cersei. But when you start with Daenerys, when you see her, she's basically a child. She's very young in the books. I think the books placed her somewhere around 12 to 14 years old. She's identified as being hidden. She's a secret heir to the throne, in Westeros. So they're protecting her and keeping her alive. They also know, the people who are protecting her, that she's their meal ticket, that if they can keep her alive and they can put her on the throne, that they'll be set and they'll be good. One of whom is her brother, who's Viserys. He is the pinnacle of evil. He will do anything to get power and to gain control, including selling his sister off to the highest bidder. So he basically exchanges his sister, who's Daenerys, to Khal Drogo, who is the leader of a large tribe of warriors. And basically, in exchange for his protection and for his army to help him start creating his whole persona to take over other parts of the world, and then to move to Westeros, which is what Daenerys eventually does. But she gets there through a lot of different things. So, as a child on her wedding night, she's shown terrified, young, basically hunching over, afraid of the expectation of what's about to happen. Khal Drogo very sort of stoically does what he does. They have sex. Then there's kind of like a cut to like a few months later, and you see them like in love with each other and all over each other and kissing, and you see from the body language that this is her man, like this is her person, and this is her soulmate. And she continues throughout the course of the show to really utilize her experience with him and her relationship with him as a source of her power and as a source of her strength. And later on in the series, when he dies and when she's left alone, and at the point where she could be killed, because she has no protection, she has no husband, she has no power anymore because her husband is gone, she has a reckoning to basically take that control back. And a lot of the way that control and that power is directed comes from her having a lot of flashbacks of Khal Drogo and her almost summoning the strength from her relationship and her connection with Khal Drogo to be Khaleesi. And that's who she becomes from that moment. So she starts out as a child, and then she's basically a child wife, and then she becomes a Khaleesi, who is the leader, who is the commander of the tribes. And then she becomes, all of the other things, the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons, all of these types of things follow. For Sansa, though, to sort of, flip the coin around to Sansa, where Daenerys rarely, if ever, comments on her experiences with rape and assault. So very later on in the show, Sansa is asked by the Hound, Gregor Clegane, who is basically her best friend throughout the whole series. They're connected. He looks out for her. They look out for each other in ways that you would never expect. And he asks her, why didn't you come with me when I wanted you to come? You could have saved yourself from all of this. And by all of this, I mean her being raped by Ramsay Bolton, married to him, shuffled around, then to Tyrion Lannister, expected to have sex and be with him. All of these different types of people she's passed around from men to men. So he asks her, why did you do it? Would you have come with me? And she basically says that she wouldn't have become the woman she is now if these things didn't happen to her. Now, that's absolutely not to take away from that experience, because that experience is real. And there are people who will say, everything that happened to me, everything I've been through, I'm grateful for it. I embrace it. It's who I am. It's a part of me. And we absolutely cannot take away from that perspective. However, when it's continually used as the main lens for how we process sexual assault and rape, it becomes the only response that we expect to see. And if somebody isn't doing that as easily, if somebody isn't putting left and right and going to that healing and empowerment and the hero's journey, we think as society that something's wrong with them, or we think they have a problem, or they're somehow confused. So there's lots of different angles and ways in which the women receive similar acts of brutality, receive rape and assault and, dominance, but are utilizing it in ways that all bring themselves to moments of strength and moments of power. And it's interesting because when George R.R. Martin was interviewed and asked about this, they said, why was this so necessary? Why did you have so much rape? And, and he basically says, well, this is medieval history and we have to be accurate to medieval history. So a couple of things here, that are really interesting is this is from a male perspective, a white male perspective, a European white male perspective. We also don't have any sort of firsthand accounts or commentary or direct experience on what actually happened in medieval ages. We don't know exactly how much rape there was, who was raped, when it happened, how it happened. So for him to pose this as historically accurate is another way to use the lens of privilege to tell the story that he wanted to tell.
I think those are excellent points, and I agree. Where I want to reiterate, absolutely, like as survivors go through their healing journey, and that looks different for everyone. And I agree that people can use their experience and derive meaning from it, and that could be part of their healing journey. And it could also not be. And I think that you're absolutely right. And part of the issue is kind of having that narrative of this is how you're supposed to act, and this is how your healing journey is supposed to look, can be really damaging for everyone. And also the fact that it's used so frequently, abuse is used so frequently in the media, I think is, as character development, is really the issue that we kind of want to highlight and look into more. Megan, I think that you might have more examples to bring up, so I wanted to give you the floor once again.
Yeah, thank you. And Taryn, you brought up the historical part of all of this and how, we weren't there. We don't know exactly what happened. And that reminded me of the example, one of the big shows right now from History Channel is Vikings. I believe they're on their final season, either 6 or 7. And throughout that entire show, traditionally with Viking culture, it's extremely violent. And I remember within the first couple episodes of season 1, there was a slave woman and she was just before a raid, she was just taken without consent. And then he just said, okay, continue on, and left to go on his raid. And, I'm just thinking too, is this accurately depicting history? Both that example, and there's more vivid examples with more prominent characters throughout. For example, I believe either season 2 or 3, Lagertha, which is the big shield maiden, everyone knows her who knows Viking culture. Her husband at the time, again, it's been a while, so I don't remember his name offhand, but he tried to assault her, and she was able to fight him off given her fighting background and whatnot. And that, when you look into the history of Vikings, like, that's the story of women. It's not just being taken and then thrown to the side. So like these shows that show that example, Vikings does a really good job of having the women fighting back and whatnot, but it's still part of the narrative. And that kind of, those examples where they are fully assaulted and just kind of thrown aside, that from what the history says, that's not necessarily what happened.
Right. It's kind of irresponsible to pick and choose and say like, oh, this is what historically happened, when we're not seeing like the full picture of it, and using that kind of as a means to justify certain lenses can be kind of damaging, right?
Yeah, and that's not necessarily to say either that it did or didn't happen. Of course, we see that happen today. So there's a very good chance that it could have happened. But, in how women are represented in the writings from the Viking culture, that's not how women are represented. So why do we have to change the narrative that was written by the actual Vikings in order to get a point across?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, even in Game of Thrones, Megan, like you're saying, to speak to your point, one of the reasons why so many people were up in arms about Sansa and her being raped in the show is because that didn't happen in the books. That wasn't written in the books. So people were saying, okay, if this is so necessary and it's so much a part of the story and it's for historical accuracy, why wasn't it in the original version? Why was there a need to make Sansa endure this type of development as a character? It wasn't in the books at all. So it really speaks to your point and to Emilie's point about the lenses that we're choosing to use at certain points, because we specifically, as the writer, as the person directing the message, we want a particular message to come across.
Yeah, and it's really important, I think, to kind of do it in a responsible way too, which we'll get it more into later. But I wanted to ask this question, and anyone can jump in. Kind of, what are the key differences between? Because we're talking about the hero's journey a little bit. What are the key differences between the narrative of rape and violence as character development, and trials and abuse in the hero's journey?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, just even having Game of Thrones fresh in my mind, just taking a look at the way Jon Snow's path went versus Daenerys's path. There, and both of them at many points in the show, in the series, are the heroes, right? They're the ones that you're rooting for. Many people wanted them to kind of be together and take control over everything, because that's what everybody wanted. They looked at them as those heroes. But when we look at what each of them went through and what their trajectory was, Daenerys's past is filled with rape, assault, total dominance and control. Jon Snow is displaced over and over again. He's killed. He's brought back to life to serve another purpose. But he also, it's very interesting, his experiences with sex and how totally and completely different they are to hers. Where Daenerys was forced into sex, she was pulled into that dynamic at a very young age, basically as a child. Jon Snow, met his famous love in the show, the famous line, nothing, Jon Snow, Egret. So, and this was such a beautiful moment for so many people in the show that watched this. And if you think about, positioning Jon Snow as a rapist, or Jon Snow being raped as a part of his journey, thinking about how that totally changes, even in our minds right now, how we perceive him and what we expect of him as far as how he's going to succeed. It's not something that we see as a part of a quote unquote hero's journey. But Daenerys had a downfall, right? How did each of these journeys end? Jon Snow, ended by trying to save Daenerys from her mania, and Daenerys succumbed to her mania and was ultimately killed, and was a product of the insanity around her. So it really goes to show through the trajectories of how each of them, ended up where they were, how delicately, in some ways, Jon Snow's story was in comparison to Daenerys, and how much more she had to go through. It almost reminds me of, so many of the conversations that we have right now about racism in our society and politics, and who is elected and why. And when we think about, different groups of people, and how there are individuals who are working tremendously hard, they're tremendously successful, accomplished, and they're consistently ridiculed and dehumanized because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, their sexual orientation. But then there are groups of the privileged class who very quickly and easily will rise to the top and become the cream of the crop without even needing to have any inkling of the qualifications and credentials and intellect that other people have. So I think it's a very interesting point that you're bringing up as we look at the hero's journey.
Absolutely. I love everything that you said. It is interesting kind of seeing kind of the difference between Jon's journey and Daenerys's, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it does seem like they're supposed to be kind of like two sides of the same coin. The Song of Ice and Fire, right? And so she's the fire and he's the ice. But seeing how different it is because of gender, because of the trials that they went through, that kind of thing. Absolutely. So we talked a lot about kind of dissecting both of the all of these different, shows and other examples in the media. So, in your opinion, what could be done to help change the narrative to a more safe or positive one? How do you think, for example, depictions of sexual violence in the media can help normalize the conversation and actually break down myths surrounding rape? And are there any examples you would like to share that depict sexual violence in a realistic and educational way?
I think the big thing that, while I was doing research and watching different media outlets through this, one of the big things that I heard that really stuck with me was, the whole concept of, unless the story is about sexual assault and used to bring awareness to sexual assault and other violence, it shouldn't be used in the story plot at point blank. If it's not used to fight against rape culture, then it's for rape culture. Seems to be the end all be all. Like, this is a situation where there is no in between, in my opinion.
Yeah, thoughts on that, Taryn?
That's such a great point. I really think we have to, even like you said, before we're looking at the messaging, take a step back and look at the why, and the where and the how. And that's such a great point that you're bringing up, is what is the place? What is the purpose of this, right? And what's the value? And I think that's so important to look at. Other things I would add to that is, and this is something that's a really common thought now, in our society. We're having lots of conversations that other stories need to be heard. We talked a lot about the singular lens, the particular lens that somebody wants to send a message to, or a system, or a type of culture. But we're seeing this more and more now with, independent, areas like Netflix and Hulu, who are bringing original content and who are telling different stories, who are, who are giving the opportunity for all individuals of all walks of life and shapes and sizes and colors and languages and countries to really tell us what their experience is like. Tell us what your story is. I don't want somebody in Hollywood or behind a production camera creating that story. I want to know what the human story is. And I think we need a lot more of that, in our society. Part of it, I think, too, to speak to Megan's point again, is what is the purpose of sexual violence, and talking about that and following that through. So there are many, many times, even in politics, where we're confronted with, moments of doubt and uncertainty with our leaders. And, did this happen? And if it did, why? And what's the circumstances? And many of us don't get further than that in our conversations. We make a judgment that we're either going to believe it or we're not, and we keep going about our day. But none of us really think about how this affects us as people, and how this affects us as the way we treat each other and the way we look at each other. And we see this in ways that we don't expect, through the media, through different songs, through different things that we analyze and internalize all the time. And it's those social norms that get us used to these things, similar to the outgoing administration. Over the 4 years, so many of us became desensitized over and over again to the type of language, to people being made fun of, to who was being made fun of. We desensitized ourselves because we were overwhelmed with the stimuli. It was too much to absorb. So we got to a point where we didn't even speak about it. We just kept going. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that there's so much coming at us all the time in the media and the news and TV. And there's no processing of that. There's no, what does this mean? And how do I internalize this? Especially as children, teenagers are internalizing things like Grand Theft Auto, things that really sort of, create an opportunity to insert sexual violence in a way that's entertaining, and that dehumanizes it and devalues it and kind of puts it into a fantasy perspective, like Megan's saying, where the context and the why, there is none. It's just to really add an element of the story and create different types of characters in our mind that we see when we judge people.
I think that's such a good point, that I think there's a responsibility as far as like media creators and of representation. Representation matters. And also, there are things that could be perpetuating certain ideas that help perpetuate things like rape culture. So I do agree. Personally, I do think that if sexual violence is not used in a way to bring awareness in an educational perspective, if it's not used that way, I think that it can be quite damaging, because it's normalizing sexual violence in the sense that, you know, kind of like setting it aside and not really using the opportunity to actually break down rape myths, actually tell the story of a survivor and hold abusers accountable and all of those things. I think can be quite damaging if it's not depicted in a responsible way, because I do think that things like sexual violence need to be talked about. I mean, as an educator, that's what my job is to normalize the conversation about sexual violence. And so just removing it completely from media doesn't make sense. But telling the stories in a responsible way is absolutely a great way that we can break down rape culture and use media as a tool to break down rape culture instead of having media be the tool to prop it up, if that makes sense. I don't know if there's anything else that you, Megan, or you, Taryn, want to piggyback off of in regards to positive ways that we can, positive examples maybe that you've seen that help break down things like rape culture.
Yeah, so, you know, one of them, interestingly enough, that I have seen recently, that was a very different perspective, was from the show Shameless. It's been on for a while. One of the characters, her name is Debbie. She grew up basically on the whole show. And at one point in the show, she's 14 years old and she's hanging out with a guy who's about 18. And she really, really wants to have sex with him. And she sort of expressed this to him. And he's, you know, basically said, like, you're too young, like, we're friends, you know, I just like hanging out with you. Like, that's kind of where I want to leave it. And so basically she gets him drunk one night. She has sex with him. She's all excited and happy the next morning. She can't wait to tell him. And she tells him when he wakes up, and he's totally freaked out. And he says things, you know, not only that I've never heard on TV, but hearing them from a male perspective. He said things like, but I didn't consent to that. But I was drunk. That's rape. I didn't want to have sex with you. I didn't agree to this. That's not okay. And he gets up and basically leaves. So it was interesting because there was this moment where the word consent was used, which I don't think I've ever heard in recent times, the word consent being used in a moment where any kind of sexual violence or rape is taking place or is being addressed at all. I've never heard that. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it came from his perspective as the 18-year-old. So it's very different dynamic where, you know, I appreciated this about this scene because it also gives that power to women, where women are sexual beings too. And young girls need to also understand what healthy boundaries are and what's appropriate sexual behavior and what's not, and when it's okay and when it's not okay. And why, if somebody doesn't want to have sex with you, why it's not okay to have sex with them. You know what I mean? Like, there's just things that were so crucial and interesting that this pulled out. And then it was really interesting because it sort of pulled in, it was almost a commentary on real life within the show, because then she goes home after, you know, this guy freaks out, he leaves, she goes back to her house and she's telling her brother, Lip, she's telling him what happened. And he's a little older than her. He's maybe like 16, 17 at the time. And he says to her, you know, I don't understand why he would think that's rape. Like, you had sex with him, so what? So a couple of things here, right? This is her older brother. So her older brother is totally okay, has absolutely no issues with his 14-year-old sister having sex, period, but having sex with an 18-year-old guy. So there were no issues. And he completely validated her not understanding what his concerns were, what the guy's concerns were, the 18-year-old guy's concerns of not being, you know, not agreeing to this, not giving consent, being drunk, being under the influence, and basically raping a girl that he didn't know that he raped. So all of this was just completely glossed over. And that's very similar to what happens in society, to speaking to Megan's earlier point. You know, the abuser or the person who's putting forth that behavior is barely addressed, if at all. And if it is, it's done in a way that is maybe hyping them up, maybe making them feel proud, maybe like, you know, something that they might have accomplished, or a rite of passage somehow that they might have achieved. You know, so this to me was a really good attempt at what it could be, when you're having real conversations about sexual violence. But then I also, in a way, appreciated the brother's reaction because that's real. That's real life. And that speaks to what we're talking about with rape culture and how men and women and children, how we all internalize things like this. Oh, well, he didn't want it. She didn't want it. Oh, what are you kidding me? Oh, that's crazy. They're crazy. So completely removing all of his feelings of vulnerability, of being out of control, of being raped.
Yeah, and I just have a follow-up question on that, Taryn. Did the show, in your perspective, when you talked about that glossing over, which absolutely, of course, happens for real in real life, for lack of better term, that like you mentioned, Megan, do you think that the show was critiquing that response?
I think it was. I mean, so it's kind of funny when you watch the show, you forget that the title of the show is actually called Shameless, because there's so many things that happen and you shake your head and you're like, wow, and it's very interesting because Shameless has been described in many different types of critiques and lenses as being a typical people, like everyday people. So when we're thinking about that commentary, what that came from the brother, that's the everyday person's response, so to speak. That's what they want you to perceive as the everyman's response. And I think it even speaks more so to the normalization in a family. How a brother, an older sibling, an older brother or sister, that's a great opportunity to talk to your younger brother or sister about sex, about, knowing what's okay and what's not okay. And that wasn't done. And I think that was a commentary because there's so many of those moments between parents, between siblings, between friends, where they need information, they need to be talked to about things, and it just doesn't happen because we're afraid, we're vulnerable, we don't think it's important, we're ignorant about the situation, or we're uninformed.
I think that's such a great example of how we could how the media can depict sexual violence in a way that can break down rape myths, because there's this rape myth that men always want sex. They why would they ever say no? And that's such a important thing to break down, because there are male survivors of sexual violence, of course, and that is a myth, right? I also want to uplift the fact that they showed depicted a female perpetrator. Absolutely, that can happen. So I think that's such a great example of how a positive example of how sexual violence depicted in the media can break down things like rape culture. Megan, did you have any examples that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I think, another big point and something we've mentioned throughout this podcast is, the implications of mental health and how assault impacts mental health as well. And the positive example that I came up with is from the Netflix show Sex Education, which is based in the UK, and how the character of Amy Gibbs was riding on the bus, and she was, just normal public transit, and she noticed that the guy behind her was in a way masturbating, and then ejaculated onto her legs. And when she turned around, he like gave her a smile, and she's like, okay, I need to get off the bus, I can't do this, like natural trauma response. And that, the storyline after the fact was, the tip, for lack of a better word, typical or a common response to a traumatic event like that is, at first you're kind of don't understand what happened, you're in shock, you're like, oh no, that, like, I remember one of the other characters told her, she's like, you've been assaulted, you need to go report this. And she's like, no, that's not what happened, it was a coincidence, or it wasn't that big of a deal, I just need to get on through the day, and I need to change. Like, her biggest concern was that her pants were stained. So, just going through that, but through the rest of the narrative was about her working through that trauma and overcoming the mental health of it. The representation didn't victimize her in any way beyond the fact that she was a victim of sexual assault. In a way, her character quickly moved from victim to survivor and eventually thriver, where she worked through that. She did her work that she needed to, and then she continued on with her life as it was already going. And I feel like that really depicts how, it not only combated the stigma around mental health and trauma, but it also kind of combated an overarching theme that we've seen throughout our discussion of oh, if you've experienced trauma, you have to be broken, and like your journey is different than everyone else's if you've had a traumatic experience like this. And the example of Amy experiencing her assault and continuing on kind of debunks that myth and shows that, okay, you do not become your assault or your mental illness after you have this experience.
That is such an amazing example. Another rape myth that we break down a lot, at least in the trainings that I do, is this idea that a survivor of trauma will be hysterical. While that can definitely be the case, it's important that we depict that there are a lot of different ways to respond to trauma, and they're normal too. So what you were mentioning, Megan, about how there was just this denial or disbelief of what happened, that is a normal response to trauma. That's not always the response, but it's important that we showcase different types of responses to trauma for survivors out there, and also their supporters, and for us to understand trauma in general, that there's a lot of different ways that people can respond to it. And then I love that idea of kind of the healing journey that they depicted, and absolutely, like, from victim to survivor to thriver as well. And also, healing looks different for everyone too, and it's not linear, and all that kind of stuff. I'm really glad that they showed at the end that she was able to process it, and I'm glad that they did that in a responsible way. I hope that was a really helpful example for people out there who are watching, who might be survivors, and hopefully that was a hopeful message that they received, which kind of leads me to my last question here for everyone. What can someone do, a survivor or a supporter, what can someone do if they have a strong response to this narrative, and where can someone go to get continued support?
Yeah, and Emilie, to carry off from what you were finishing too, one of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung, who is a psychodynamic psychologist, there we go, is, I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. And I feel like, we talked about the hero's journey and how, heroes get to overcome obstacles and continue to be who they want to be. And there is absolutely no reason why someone who experiences assault or otherwise violent crimes cannot have that same experience. And I would also like to add, if you have not taken a deep breath yet, go ahead and do that now. I definitely have taken a few as we've continued on. And I think another important thing to do too is, this can be really hard to hear as a survivor, thinking I've internalized these messages and that could greatly influence how I approach healing. But I also think it's important to recognize and note the difference between reality and fiction. Like Taryn said about halfway through, it's completely fine if this is your story. Your healing journey is yours. There is no wrong way to react to trauma and assault and otherwise violent crimes. Also, these narratives don't have to be added to fictional stories like we see in the media. Even if these stories are based off of things that have actually happened, it doesn't have to be added in. This is purely for entertainment purposes, and unless unless it is for education or awareness, assault should not be added for entertainment, because it's not entertaining. It's a very serious trauma to experience. And finally, Emilie, to answer your last question, I did come up with some resources that I believe we could have added, different phone numbers and websites we could have added in the description of the chat, mostly like Victim Service Center and Vibes phone number, and also kind of some hotlines and different websites based on cultural identities and different things like that.
So beautifully said, Megan. Thank you so much. I love that you brought in Carl Jung, which is really interesting because he's famous for archetypes and storytelling. So that's a great quote to bring up. And absolutely, I love that you also said that there's no wrong way to react to trauma. Absolutely. And always, as always, the Victim Service Center is here for you if you're feeling overwhelmed and you need someone to talk to. We're absolutely here 24/7. I will add, as always, the 24/7 helpline, which is 407-500-HEAL, HEAL. We're here for anyone, even if you're not in the Central Florida community. We can, connect you to, help you connect to local resources as well. But I wanted to give the floor to Taryn now, and to talk about any resources that you might have, or any tips or anything if survivors or anyone who watches these narratives that might be perpetuating that internalization that you were mentioning, Megan. What can they do if they're feeling overwhelmed, and who can they reach out to?
Absolutely. And I think it's such an important question. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in the workshops and the trainings that we do is, just like now throughout this podcast, somebody may be listening that might have heard a word or a phrase: sexual violence, rape, assault, domestic violence. And they may be putting together the dots and connecting that and forming some kind of thought that maybe that's what happened to them. And maybe this is what they've experienced. Many of our clients will talk about they never knew what it was called. They didn't know it was domestic violence. They didn't know it was abuse. They didn't know it was sexual assault. They didn't know it was human trafficking. They didn't know that that's what this was. They didn't know it was elder abuse. So this can be scary at first. This can be sort of a reckoning, but it can also be like, oh my goodness. So what I would say is, if there are words that you heard in this podcast or language that you see that speaks to you for whatever reason, whether it's for your own perspective or others, I would encourage you to do some searching. Look up local resources that are important to you, that are nearby, or even if, let's say, if it's domestic violence or sexual assault, look up what that is. Very quickly, you're going to find a lot of really good, reputable resources like RAINN, the Rape and Incest National Network. You're going to find, all different types of amazing resources, the National Crisis Center Hotline, Polaris Project for Human Trafficking, that will give you some information. And for some people, information can be overwhelming, but for some people, information can be really powerful. It can really help them inform the types of things they want to ask about, the types of things they want to know about, because many of us feel the most vulnerable when we need things and we don't know how to tell people what we need. So what I would suggest is, if there's anything that resonated, take a minute, look it up on your phone, and guess what? It's your phone. Nobody's going to know that you looked it up. Just because you looked up something doesn't mean that you're experiencing that, doesn't mean you're a product of that. It means that you're curious and you want to find out more about it. And if you may be thinking of a friend or someone you know during this podcast that is experiencing some of the things that we've talked about or some of the forms of abuse, don't be a superhero. Don't go in and say, hey, guess what? I learned about this sexual assault and I think that's what's going on with you. And this is what you need to do. And I really think it's going to help you. All of those things very well could happen. But keep in mind, like we said, that everybody's experience is different. Everybody's journey is different. When people call our hotline at Vibes, they may have been building up that courage for years to make that phone call. They may have decided that today was the day out of all the days that they were going to seek help for themselves. And if that person is not ready, if today is not the day for that person, continue to be a support for them. Keep that door wide open. Remain a friend, remain a listener. Be quiet when they want to speak to you. Say thank you when you hear whatever you hear. Don't ask them how they want to solve it. Don't ask them how to fix it, because they don't know. They're sharing it with you in the hopes that it might alleviate some of the stress that they might be feeling. Maybe they're feeling like their glass of water is too full and they need to empty it out a little bit and they need to go to a source of support. So that's what I would say. If you're thinking of someone right now that you could help, that's something that could be really, really helpful for you. And similar to what Emilie mentioned about services, although Vibes is in Suffolk County, although we're on Long Island in New York, our hotline is for everyone. And our hotline is 631-360-3600. 3606. We also have a confidential anonymous chat that's at www.vibs.org. So it's something that if you can't be overheard, if you don't want other people in your home to know what you're going through, many people who are victims of violence, the people they're living with have no idea and they don't want them to know. And that's their right. That's that person's prerogative. And we have to respect that. So whatever way that person is seeking help or whatever way you might be seeking help, know that that's the best way for you. There might be other ways, but this is the way that you're choosing, and that's enough. And anything that you're doing to help yourself or someone else is enough. You don't have to save the day. You don't have to break down the walls. There are things that are happening in the system and our society that we cannot compete with as individuals, but we can help each other as individuals navigate those systems.
I love that. Thank you so much for all that you do at Vibes. Thank you so much for sharing your resources. I want to invite, if you are a supporter of a survivor, the VSC is actually able to give services to secondary survivors. Those are survivors, people, the supporters of those survivors as well. And you also deserve support as well. With that being said, I wanted to, before we sign off, I think that's a beautiful place to do so. Was there anything you, Megan, or you, Taryn, wanted to add to the conversation that we may not have gotten to? I just wanted to give you the floor one more time before we sign off.
Thank you, Emilie, so much for this opportunity. I'm so grateful to be able to help educate and, spread awareness of both sexual assault awareness and also mental health stigma and healing and everything involved with that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm super happy to have you both on. Absolutely.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. As we're thinking about messaging and media and what we're putting out there, it's really amazing. And I'm honored, and we're honored to be a part of this conversation so we can add to that messaging and start to break down those barriers. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. I want to thank you, Megan, and you, Taryn, so much for being here. We're so honored to have you here to have this discussion. I'm so glad that we're able to connect from so far away. That's really amazing. And I think that's a wonderful place to sign off here. So thank you, the listener, for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you're not alone. And thank you so much, Megan and Taryn, once again for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.